So today we're just going to dive into some very valuable and relevant discussions on hurricanes and cyclones, and learn a little bit from some experts on how to best report on disasters, right? So I say relevant, of course, because we're already 1 month into this season, which has already been predicted to be one of the most active seasons ever recorded, according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, their Climate Prediction Center. So we're already seeing that multiple climate factors are indicating above normal activity, and the outlook has already predicted about 60% chance of an above normal season, and we're already seeing that, which is why this webinar and the guidebook that we are publishing to help journalists report more effectively on hurricanes and cyclones is so important, because I can speak from the Atlantic side. Of course, the 2020 Atlantic hurricane is already off to a fast start, there already been 4 named storms forming, and this is all before the end of June, right? And this is already, we're already set to see more active session. So saying all of this, I'm sure you'll agree with me that as journalists, as communicators, we also need to be prepared to report on these hurricanes and cyclones and the best that we can, whether that means bringing human stories to the fore, whether it means ensuring that the public is properly informed about the role that climate change has to play in these intense and more frequent conditions, or whether it is preparing ourselves to hold those who are responsible for proper preparation and adaptation accountable, right? So at this point, I'm more than delighted to introduce you to our panel of guest speakers. And first up, we will be starting off with Santiago Saez, and he will be giving us a lesson on the science of cyclones. Santiago is the editor for Climatica, which is Spain's leading climate publication and one of the best Spanish language climate news websites. So over to you, Santi.
Thank you very much. Hopefully you can all hear me, and welcome, and thank you for being here. Well, thank you as well to Julio and Tina for joining us. I'm very excited to be here myself. Well, as Lisanne was saying, well, cyclones or tropical storms are an ongoing story at the moment, because we are in the middle of Atlantic hurricane season. But they're always going to be they're going to be an ongoing story for the next years or decades, unfortunately, because climate change increases the danger that these storms suppose. So basically, when we talk about tropical storms, the idea is that we're talking about some of the most violent, some of the most devastating impacts of climate change. They are very, very powerful, and they are quite unpredictable in the short term. So basically, you only can tell where a storm will go with a few days, sometimes even not even that of anticipation. They affect highly populated areas, like we recently saw with Cyclone Amphan that hit the Ganges Delta and in Bangladesh and India, and they can set countries' development back decades or years in just a few hours. This is the kind of destruction they produce. We have seen that, for example, when Maria hit Puerto Rico a few years ago, or when Katrina hit New Orleans, and that's already, I think, 10 years ago, 10 years ago. In the last few years as well, as I was saying, as Lisanne was saying as well, scientists have noticed a trend, and basically this trend, what it tells us is that cyclones and tropical storms are increasing in power. The most powerful cyclones are getting even more powerful. That's basically the gist of it. Actually, there's a very recent paper I can share with you. I can share with you right now, actually, on the notes here in the chat, just in case you want to see it and add a little value to being here, not just presentation. So here's a paper that I got sent this today, curiously. So basically, yeah, what we're seeing is that the strongest hurricanes get even stronger. So they already are an important story for coastal areas, especially especially for coastal tropical areas. But there will be an ongoing story, and there will be an ongoing culture, economy, and life-changing story. And as time passes and temperatures rise, unfortunately, they will become a more and more important story. To understand the nature of these storms is very important for climate reporters, regardless of whether you are on the ground in a storm-prone region or country, or if you're abroad, like I am, and you're editing or you're reporting on storms that are happening somewhere else in the world. And this is important because around storms, often we get lots of misinformation, misguided or inaccurate information. To understand the basics can give you a huge advantage at the time of spotting this misinformation. So we'll see. I'll show you some examples pretty quick. So yeah, today we're presenting this guidebook that brings together these key points to understand hurricanes and to get a grasp of what the science is around. So I'm just gonna go directly here and start my presentation, so you can get this. I'm just gonna share my whole Chrome thing. You'll see yourselves very briefly, just because I'm going to be showing some here. Everybody can see my screen, yeah? If you can't, please let me know, because right now I cannot see the chat. So basically, let's start by telling, as Disan was saying at the beginning, we talk about cyclones or hurricanes or typhoons, tropical storms, and so on and so forth. These are different names, and I think it's very important that we understand what these different names refer to. Basically, they all refer to the same thing, and these are tropical cyclones or tropical storms. A tropical storm and a tropical cyclone are basically the same in nature, that they differ in wind speed. So basically, when a tropical storm gets speeds that are over 74 miles per hour, that is here, we call it a hurricane, a typhoon, or a cyclone. If it's less than that, we call it a tropical storm. It's basically a storm system that rotates over an organized eye. That's basically what it is, and they happen over warm waters, so basically in the tropics. Now, what is the difference between a hurricane and a typhoon and a tropical cyclone? Well, they have no difference really. They are the same thing. They only change their name because of their location. So we call hurricanes those in the Atlantic and the Northeastern Pacific Ocean. So basically the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, the South and East North American coast, and the West American coast. These are hurricanes. Typhoons happen in the Western Pacific and the Northeastern Indian, so basically Philippines, the South China Sea, Japan, and China, Taiwan, and everything all on the Bengal Bay. So basically the cyclone Amphan or typhoon Amphan that we recently saw, and then tropical cyclones are elsewhere. So Australia, Africa, and so on. There are some others, and here you can see them, but I'm not going to stop at every little name. But all these will be in the guidebook that will be available quite soon. Also, you know that the typhoons and hurricanes get names. So Hurricane Ike, Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Harvey, whatever. These naming conventions, they're quite interesting. And it's interesting because since the 1950s, tropical storms and hurricanes have had names. Before that, it was very confusing to name them because they were named with numbers and so on. And it was a bit strange when more than one hurricane was going on at the same time. I'm saying hurricane just because I'm used to covering the the um, the Atlantic season, but actually I'm talking about cyclones. Somebody's knocking at the door and they need me to admit them. I don't know if somebody else can admit them or it needs to be me. Apparently, yeah. Okay, so I'll come back to my presentation. Okay. All right, so as I was saying, there is naming, the naming conventions, yeah. So what is important here, and I want you to know, is that these names repeat after time. In the Atlantic hurricanes conventions, it's every 6 years these names rotate. Sometimes the names are retired when a hurricane is so destructive, but usually the same names coming over and over again. So when you see a name of a hurricane, make sure that you're talking about the right one, especially when you read background. And each region has a different naming system. So the names in the Atlantic rotate, the names in the Pacific rotate, the names in the Indian Ocean rotate. All of these, they have links in the guidebook to all the names, so you can exactly know more or less when a hurricane is going to happen. Intensity scales. Okay, so these, when you hear a hurricane or a typhoon or a cyclone, is category 1, category 5. These measure the wind speed. This is not only the only destructive impact of hurricanes, or the only measure that we see, and we're going to see that in a second. But when you hear yeah, it's a category 3 hurricane. That means it's a Saffir-Simpson scale 3. That means a particular wind speed. The maximum is 5. The minimum is 1. When they reach 1, that means they get a name, and this is what Desan also was mentioning, with 4 named storms already. That means storms that have gone over a certain wind speed. They are different. We use different scales for hurricanes, typhoons, and cyclones. All of them are very explicitly mentioned and linked to in the guidebook. This is something I'm not going to stop in. Okay, I'm going to focus on the scientific reporting of cyclones. I'm going to leave the rest to Julio and Tina. But I want to stop a little bit and tell you what, from my point of view as an editor of a climate news site, what kinds of reporting we have when we talk about tropical storms. So scientific reporting is one type of reporting, and this means talking about the nature of the cyclones, the relationship with the climate change, but also understanding how they move, how they evolve from a tropical depression to a hurricane or a typhoon or a cyclone. And this is a very important knowledge, I think, for anyone, regardless of whether you're on the ground or not. But this is not the only kind of reporting. There's others, for example, of course, on the ground reporting, and this is crucial as well, because basically people are going to be relying on this information for their survival, to put it bluntly. And then there's another kind of reporting that I'm very interested in, and it's the cultural reporting and the political reporting and the social reporting, because hurricanes don't come just and then leave and that's it. They create political culture, they create policy. So all adaptation, all economic policy, all culture created around these storms is also an incredibly valuable and compelling source of stories. So I would encourage you to find these stories and tell them. You can write a short story, or you can write a huge TV series about this. And if you haven't watched Treme by David Simon, that's a great opportunity to see how you can write a 3 or 4 season TV show about the culture of a hurricane, and that's about Katrina and its aftermath. David Simon, by the way, was a journalist before he was a TV series writer, so he knows what he's talking about. Finally, I'm going to get into the scientific reporting a little bit and tell you a little bit about what is what are tropical cyclones and how to understand this these little numbers and these little circumstances that can tell you if an information is accurate or reliable or not. So basically, what is a tropical cyclone? Okay, a tropical cyclone, very bluntly, in 2 sentences, as you see it here, it's an area of extremely low pressure around which a storm system rotates. It can have many storms. Actually, it does have many thunderstorms, and they can be of different severity. But they always have a center that is defined, and it moves around it. Cyclone comes from a Greek word that is cyclos. That means basically around. It's the same word from which the word cycle comes, or bicycle comes, or motorcycle. Things are around. In this case, in the bicycle and the motorcycle, we're talking about the wheels, obviously. They occur over warm waters. Most times this means in the tropical waters, although there are some records of tropical storms happening outside tropical waters, but you can disregard those. They are not common at all. Another thing that is very important, and it's not written here, it will be written later, is that they have a convective current. So basically, the air rises through the center of the storm and goes down over the edges of the storm. This makes them extremely destructive, and this is a big difference with extratropical storms, or storms that happen outside the tropics, where the energy moves horizontally. And in a tropical storm, energy moves in a vertical way, and this, as we're going to see in a second, makes some differences that actually makes these particular storms very, very destructive and powerful. As you can see here. Okay, so tropical cyclone. Okay, this is all I talked right now. I forgot I had this slide. I probably should have moved it. But yeah, here you can see a diagram of what it is, and we're going to see the parts of a cyclone right in a second. So typically, a tropical cyclone has 3 parts. The central part, the whole, if you want it, is the eye. The eye is at the center of the system, not necessarily at the center if you see a picture, but it's around which all the rest revolves. It is calm, and it's important because wherever the eye is where we say the hurricane is, or the cyclone. When any part of the eye moves over land, we say the cyclone has made landfall. And this is something you're going to see in the news all the time, and it's a very important moment for a cyclone. And it's important why? Well, this is the second part. Is because when the eye touches the land, that means the eye wall has touched the land as well. The eye wall is the immediate part that is close to the eye, and this part has the most powerful winds. That's why even if a part that is in the eye is instantly safe because the eye is calm, whatever it is in imminent danger because the eye will move, and then the eye wall will touch that part of land or sea, and basically that's the most destructive part of the cyclone. And finally, the rain bands. Rain bands are these bands that you see here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but basically are these bands, and these are the storms that revolve around the center. They can span for hundreds of kilometers. Usually they do span for hundreds of kilometers, and they bring heavy rain, so they cause floods. I'm going to talk about this real quick. I'm not going to stop a lot on this slide because all this is in the guidebook, and it's all numbers and effects. But I would like to tell you a little bit about some of the impacts of a cyclone, and then I'm going to show you some excellent reporting. In this case, TV reporting on winds and storm surge, which are 2 of the impacts. So winds are the most famous part of a hurricane or a cyclone. Is what you hear all the time. Is what you measure the power of the category of the cyclone through. They can reach over 200 miles per hour, 320, 330 kilometers per hour, and they destroy buildings, they destroy infrastructure. Yeah, so these are the winds. But the winds are not the only impacts or effects of a cyclone. I would like you to stop and think of storm surge. And I would like this storm surge is probably the most devastating, more often, the most devastating effect of a cyclone. Is a sudden rise in the sea level, basically. Imagine that you are drinking through a straw. You're drinking a liquid through a straw. You decrease the pressure with your mouth by sucking, and then the level inside the straw raises. Okay, this is what a cyclone does, basically. As it has very low pressure, it kind of sucks the sea on land, which obviously is extremely dangerous. This can cause widespread floods, even many kilometers inland, and this can cut evacuation routes. This is what happened with Harvey in Houston not so long ago, just like 4 or 5 years ago. And then heavy rain, of course. A cyclone has storms associated to it, and they can have pretty dangerous rainfall quantity, which can then lead to other disasters such as floods, mudslides, landslides, and then associated disaster by destroying infrastructure such as dams, landfills, and so on. This can in turn contaminate fresh water or bring in diseases. This can happen with any rain, but basically cyclones always bring rain. So it's important to take that into account. And finally, as you can see in this slide, cyclones also spawn tornadoes sometimes, which is pretty scary and destructive too. Here you can see the places where cyclones occur and the different seasons that we have. But basically, I'm not going to stop on that. It's all in the guidebook and it's also online. Although it took a while to find all these. They are not all collected in one place. And then finally, I want to tell you, well, not finally. Oh, I show you I haven't shown you the examples. I'm going to show you real quick the wind, very good wind reporting. Here you have some excellent wind reporting. Can you hear it?
Yes, we can hear.
Perfect. This is about the wind.
Category 1 storm. And the damage here not too bad. A couple of shingles fall off, you can have some palm fronds bending in the wind, but everything basically remains intact. Category 2, that's where you really start to feel it. Look at the windows of the house. They can be hit from debris from the outside and already start breaking. In Category 2, your trees are significantly bent over in the wind, and the siding of the house itself can break, flapping there in the wind, adding to those eerie noises inside. Category 3. I've heard only a Category 3, but it's not only anything except really bad news. In a Category 3, you're going to have the door of the house blown in because the winds get so strong. You're going to have the roof of the house sort of flap up and down in the wind because it's going to lift off those weak points.
Let's try to Category 5, just to show you, because I don't want to take so long and I want to have time to show you the rest. Okay, this is obviously excellent reporting. Not everybody has these resources, but I thought I would show you this. There's another one from the Weather Channel that I'm going to show you real quick. I'm just also going to skip to the interesting part. This is, yeah, about storm surge.
This hurricane Florence continues to close in on the southeastern United States, and will carry with it significant storm surge and life-threatening inundation. Let's look at these maps, for example, created by the National Hurricane Center, to give us almost a block-by-block assessment of how much water rise you can expect.
Okay. That's going to go here.
We know Florence is going to bring 1 to 3 feet of inundation across many locations. That certainly is enough to knock you off your feet. It can definitely stall cars out, even carry cars away, and certainly flood many of the lower levels of structure. But we know Florence is also going to bring water rises well above that, perhaps up to 6 feet. Now, 6 feet of water, imagine that. That carries large objects in it, like cars, for example, that can act like battery ramps and enhance the damage that would otherwise be. And also, we know that can flood the lower levels of any structure. We also know that Florence can carry with it lightning storm surge well above that, perhaps 9, 10 feet, maybe more. That will totally cover up one-story buildings and structures, leaving them underwater, and certainly pose.
Okay, so that, as you can see, that those are excellent reporting examples. Obviously, as I said, not everybody has the resources to make such cool videos, like augmented reality videos and so on. But these are ways to explain really well to a population that may not be acquainted with the terms of storm surge or what does this actually mean. This is a very good way of explaining, or a category 5 or category 4. Well, these, you can show them these videos. You don't need them. You don't need to make them yourselves. These are from the Weather Channel, which is I'm not particularly a fan of, but they certainly make very cool augmented reality videos. Finally, I would like to tell you a little bit about climate change and a little bit about numbers. These are going to go relatively quick as well. About climate change, very important. As I said before, tropical cyclones, as well as many other severe weather events, cannot be usually attributed directly to climate change. So you cannot say climate change caused Hurricane Irma or Hurricane Harvey or Cyclone Amphan. You cannot say that, but that you can say, as I shared before, the climate change is making these hurricanes more, these cyclones and typhoons, more often and more powerful. Imagine that you have this little die, okay? A die, like you're playing a game, like a pair of dice, yeah? So you have this, and if you throw it, you have 1/6 of a chance to get each number. And if you load this die, you make it more heavy on one side, you'll have more chances to get that number, but not really, you will not get always this number, right? And if you get that number, doesn't mean that without the load, you wouldn't have had it, that number either. I mean, so this is more or less the idea. Climate change is a load in the die. There is a very interesting group in the US that's called World Weather Attribution, and they make studies about this. I've been searching though there to share something with you, but really they don't have anything really modern, like really new from this season there. So I can share the link with you if you prefer, and you can go and explore all their resources. And finally, I would like to tell you a few things about the numbers, and I know I'm getting really late, but this is important. Because the numbers, when you get information from official sources, particularly from meteorological agencies, you will get a lot of numbers, and you need to understand these numbers. One number that you're going to get right away is the pressure. This has no mystery. It identifies the air pressure, the atmospheric pressure in the eye. So basically, it's the minimum pressure of the system. And the lower it is, the more dangerous the cyclone is. Obviously, it's going to suck more air up and water and stuff. It's often measured in millibars. Then the wind speed, and the wind speed is also important to understand. We have two different measures of wind speed. One is the sustained wind, that basically is the average maximum. So if I tell you that Hurricane Dorian was 200 miles per hour, that means that those are winds that go on at that speed for a minimum of 2 minutes. If there is speeds over that go for shorter time, those are gusts. And these are also measured and also given in those reports. So it's important that you hear both of them. And both of them are very destructive. The higher these numbers are, obviously, the more dangerous the cyclone is. And finally, something very, very important, the translation speed. And this is the speed at which the eye of the cyclone moves. The cyclones are not stationary. They are not born in a place and they stay there. They move on the sea and then they move on land. And the faster that they move, the less dangerous they are. And this is sometimes counterintuitive because we always think of something that is fast as something that is dangerous, and something that is slow as something that is safe. But that's not the case here. And if a cyclone moves extremely slowly, that makes it extremely dangerous. Basically because it stays on the same place for a long time, and then it destroys it. It has more time to destroy it. This is what happened last year with Hurricane Dorian over the Bahamas, where it was a very powerful storm, but the most dangerous part of it was that it stayed for 24 hours, basically, stationary over one particular place. This speed is often measured in knots. And finally, the rainfall. I don't think I need to go over the rainfall, of course, because obviously it is self-explanatory. The more rainfall it is, the more dangerous. Usually is measured in inches, millimeters, or liters per square meter. This is wrong. It says liters per meter, but it's actually per square meter. Depends on what kind of cyclone, what area you're covering. But basically, they are quite similar as measured. Yeah, it's interesting to know as well that some of this data is collected by satellites, and some of this is using aircraft. This aircraft goes into the cyclones, and it's very, now with unmanned aircraft, drones, and so on, it's easier to get this data. So that's also another reason why cyclones are quite unknown, because until now, with advanced technology, it was not so easy to gather data on these events. And finally, something that is very, very important. This is my last slide, I promise. A cone. So the cone is something you're going to see always. Every time that you see a hurricane, you're going to see the cone. The cone is called the cone of uncertainty, and basically tells you where a cyclone, a hurricane, typhoon, where it's going to be in a few hours, on a few days. But it doesn't tell you exactly where it's going to be, but where can it be. There is a common error among journalists and among reporters to think that this area inside the cone is the area that is going to be affected. That is not the case. This is the area where the eye may be at this time. So 8 a.m. Saturday means the eye has a high certainty of being inside this area. It can be here and affect areas outside the cone, or it can be here and affect areas outside the cone. And it can also be in the center and accept all the areas in the cone. This, as I said, this doesn't represent the area that will be impacted. It represents where the eye may be. Understanding this is very important because there's also a lot of misinformation, and also because there are errors, many errors interpreting cones, and this error can be life-threatening. So if you are showing this cone and you are not making this clear, people in northern Florida may think they are safe because they are outside the cone, but they are absolutely not safe in this particular event. And then when this happens, when this is not understood, journalists can have problems understanding it, and then they can have problems like this. And I'm going to end on a high note, I hope, with a little bit of a joke. Well, it's not really funny. It's actually quite tragic, but I think it's important. And it's, yeah, it's not funny, but you can laugh at somebody. This is Donald Trump, as you know. This is about Hurricane Dorian last year. He told a few days before that Alabama was going to be impacted. So when he showed the cone, as you see, he had drawn with a Sharpie. Okay, this is kind of fun. With a Sharpie here, as if this part was going to be impacted. Obviously, this is egregious, but it also shows that he doesn't know how a cone works and what it means. Alabama could have been impacted by the cyclone being here, the eye being here. So actually, he didn't need to draw that. That just shows that he manipulated the image and that he has no clue about what he was talking about. So that is it, I think. I'm coming back to here, and whoa, there's a lot of information here. Okay. All right, so all this information, all these examples are going to be in the guidebook, which I recommend you check in a few days. I'm sorry I took, I think, a bit longer than expected, so I'll just stop it without any further ado. Thank you very much, guys. Back to you, Design.
Thank you so much, Santiago. That was really insightful. And it's funny that towards the end that you mentioned, you know, the direction where these hurricanes in the Atlantic usually go, in the direction that they usually go. And it's really interesting to note as well that that is actually changing. And usually, so I'm from Trinidad, which is the most southern Caribbean island, and usually people say that we're always safe from hurricanes because it tends to go upward and completely not affect us. But a lot of the hurricanes are actually forming more in a southerly direction now. So I think that's really interesting to see changes that are happening. So not only are they happening more often and more intense, but the direction which they are taking, right? Which is also that's super interesting to look at as well. So I'm gonna jump straight in now to our next presenter, who is Christine Sabio. Christine is a TV reporter for ABS-CBN News in Philippines, and she's also a former Climate Tracker Fellow to the United Nations Secretary General Climate Week in New York. So I'm really interested to hear from the side of the Philippines and Southeast Asia and how that's going. So straight over to you, Christine.
Thank you, Dizan. I guess I wouldn't call myself an expert on typhoon reporting, but if you're from a country like the Philippines, all reporters here are, I guess, experts compared to the reporters from other parts of the world who do not have as much, a lot of typhoons like us. So let me just go straight to my presentation. I'll just share my slide. Okay, are you guys seeing the slides?
Not at the, now, yeah. Now I am.
Is that okay? Okay. So as I said, I'm not an expert on typhoon reporting, but typhoon reporting is important to me because it was my jump-off point for climate change reporting. It was really my exposure to the devastation of typhoons in the Philippines that made me think more deeply about the effects of climate change. So if you guys don't know, the Philippines has once been said to be the most storm-exposed country in the world. It's along the Pacific typhoon belt, and it's visited by an average of 20 typhoons per year. 8 to 9 of them make landfall, and 5 are considered destructive. So the worst was Typhoon Yolanda or Haiyan in 2013 that left more than 6,000 people dead and almost 2,000 people missing. So in our country, we're used to, because we get a lot of typhoons, we're used to the regular weather forecast. And I guess there are just a few things that you have to remember if you're monitoring a typhoon. The first one that you ask is it in the area of responsibility of the Philippines already? And if it is in the PAR, we call it the PAR, is it a typhoon already? And as Santiago mentioned, it's important to know if it will make landfall. If it will make landfall, it is expected to be more destructive or damaging. And another important factor to look into is whether it will hit Metro Manila, which is our main metropolis area, or other major cities in the country. So for the Philippines, most Filipinos would just be interested in what's the typhoon signal number for their province. So I used to work for a daily, a broadsheet, an online website. We would come out with this infographics. Visualization, I think, is very important when it comes to typhoon reporting because the people need to know, especially in a country like the Philippines, where you have a lot of islands. They need to know if their area will be directly hit by the typhoon. So as you can see, signal number 3 is in the red. So signal number 3 is people know that if the typhoon will be signal number 3 in your province, it's important to just stay indoors. And usually at signal number 2, there are no classes anymore. So we report details like the speed, the possible rainfall, but it's really the signal number that the ordinary Filipinos are interested in. So for monitoring, we usually get a daily updates from our State Weather Bureau at 6 a.m. or 6 p.m. It becomes more, I think, every hour depending on how destructive the typhoon is expected to be. So The important things to note when writing this, these are like our format stories, who will be most affected. So there's always a warning for fishermen should they still go out to sea. What is it a typhoon? What is its name? As Santiago mentioned, there are different names. The Philippines used to name its typhoons using names of women, but they changed that recently because it's sexist. And then again, it's important to know when it's going to make landfall, which provinces will be worst hit. And in this case of the example I gave, this is a story I wrote, if it will affect other weather systems like the monsoon, because that would mean it would bring in more rains. And finally, I think this is the most important, is how it will affect us, floods and storm surges. Before Typhoon Haiyan in 2013, we really didn't emphasize that much the concept of the storm surge. And after that, I think we've all learned our lesson. And it's important to warn people how high the storm surge will be. Will it be 6 feet? Will it be, higher than a person? Because at least they will know that, this is a really dangerous typhoon and they should stay indoors or upland. So here's my tip for spicing up weather monitoring stories. So it's important to look for context. For example, is this area once hit by a strong typhoon? For example, in the Philippines, after Haiyan, the Eastern Visayas region is a relatively poor region, one of the poorest in the country. So every time a crisis or a tragedy will hit the region, there's always the angle that it hasn't even recovered yet from what happened in 2013. So it's like an additional burden for them to be facing another typhoon. It was the area hit by another disaster before, maybe not a typhoon, like an earthquake, and is it comparable to previous destructive typhoons? So that's one thing we do. We sometimes compare, okay, the speed of this typhoon is comparable to this typhoon that hit the country in 2001, something like that. And then after causing widespread damage to the Philippines, where will it wreak havoc next? So maybe it will hit Taiwan or Hong Kong. So it's important to always include context in reporting of weather stories. So they asked me to share what my tips would be for field reporting. These are the things that I learned reporting for TV. I think number one is you need a vehicle that can survive a flood, especially in the Philippines where we don't have good drainage. It's always flooding even after the typhoon, the flood stays. So if you're going out there, you need to have a vehicle that you can rely on to go around and shoot videos, for example. Of course, you need an umbrella. It's not just for you, but also for your camera if you're shooting. Because if the rain is really hard and the wind is so strong, you need an umbrella to protect your camera. Of course, waterproof jacket or windbreaker, boots, not the fashionable kind, but the one that you actually could wear in a flood, so the water won't get into your clothes. And a waterproof bag. And I always bring like a piece of plastic or a Ziploc, for example, to keep your phones inside to protect it against the rain. This will also be important if you're a mobile journalist and you only shoot using your phone. So you need to find a way to protect your phone if you don't have a waterproof pack. And of course, a protector for your video camera. If you don't have a protector, a cheap alternative would be a trash bag. Sometimes our cameramen do that. And for your reporting gadgets, I always bring 2 phones because the problem when there's a typhoon, the signal is not that good. So sometimes one of the 2 networks won't work well. I would switch to the other network. Of course, a power bank, a power cord for a vehicle. Personally, I don't bring a laptop when I cover typhoons because there's a huge possibility that you'll fall into a flood or something like that, or your vehicle will get stuck in a flood, and I really don't want to risk my files being lost. And if it's necessary, you should also bring a satellite phone. It would also help if you bring a first aid kit. For some of us, we're issued like a doxycycline. It's the medicine against leptospirosis, because if you get exposed to flood water, and if it's dirty, you might get a bacterial infection. So that's an important thing to think about. Or after, you need to take medicine like that. And flashlight. Flashlight and food and water, of course. So before the typhoon hits, what are the things that you should be covering? So typhoon preparations of the government and the residents, and of course communities most likely affected, such as the homeless and flood-prone areas. I just included here a clip of a report I did in 2018 for typhoon. Let me just play it.
Karen, sa totoo lang, nagsimula na ngang magsilikas yung mga tao dito sa Manila Bay. Umalis dahil kapag umuulan nga, mas marami silang nakukuhang basura o yung kalakal. Si Aling Denayda naman na 60 taong gulang, mas natakot pang mahuli kaysa abutin ng bagyo.
Para sa amin ang mga nangangalakal, maganda may bagyo. Kasi doon po kami kumikita.
Ito lang ang pinabubuhay ko, ma'am eh. Dahil nakakatulong kami, nakakabawas kami ng mga basura na yan.
Okay, so when you're in a country like the Philippines, typhoon stories become more like a format or a stereotypical story that you do every year. So you have to find like interesting angles to it. So in this case, we checked on Manila Bay and what the trash collectors were doing. They were also homeless people. So it's always important to see how the typhoon would affect different kinds of communities. So during actual landfall, personally, I don't like, I think it's a personal decision if you would decide to actually go out and cover a typhoon as it makes landfall. And it's actually a debate, for example, in the Philippines. Do you go out to show the people how strong the typhoon is, or do you stay inside? Because after all, that's what we're telling the people. They should be staying inside and keeping themselves safe. But I wanted to share this this report. This is not by me. This is from another reporter. He used to work with our network. And this went viral because this is Yolanda, in case you're not that familiar with how strong Yolanda was.
Nandito tayo ngayon sa may pier ng Tacloban at napakalakas na ng hangin, pero hindi pa po tumatama ang sentro ng bagyo dito sa bahagi ng Tacloban. Dito po sa karagatan at diretso tumutumbok dito sa bahagi ng Leyte, kung saan tayo nagla-live ngayon na TV dito sa bahagi ng Tacloban. Kasalukuyan na ang binabayo ng malakas na hangin itong syudad. Dito lang tayo sa mga gilid ng mga building para makapag-kubli ng konti. Pero sa ngayon, kailangan ko lang inarawat sa inyo yung nararamdaman nating lakas ng hangin dito. Napakalakas at kung mapapansin nyo nga halos wala na tayong makita dahil doon sa kasama niyang ulan.
Mabilis na tumaas ang tubig na halos inabot ng 10 talampakan. Walang kuryente sa Tacloban City, hindi rin gumagana ang telepono.
So the last part there is actually the storm surge that Santiago was mentioning. You really just have to admire these reporters who are courageous enough to actually go out and cover the landfall of a strong typhoon like Yolanda. But I would just suggest that you should be really ready for anything that can happen if you do decide to cover the actual landfall. So the coverage after the typhoon can be the shortest part of your coverage if the typhoon is weak. So it's usually just fallen logs or damage to agriculture, not a lot of fatalities. But it can also be the longest part if it's devastating. Later, I'm going to talk about my coverage on the aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan. I went there 2 weeks after the typhoon, but there were still a lot of things to report on. So after the typhoon, the things that you need to cover are the loss of life, damage to property, what we call the new normal, or things that change for the everyday life of the affected residents. Of course, government response, international aid, and human stories. You really have to cover and see on the individual level, how has the typhoon affected the lives of these people? So that's really good for TV, for visuals and features as well. Oops. This is an example of a report I did. There are villages in the Philippines that get flooded easily, and after the typhoon passes, the flooding stays for like days and weeks.
Ginawang tabo na lang ni Aling Teresa ang kanyang pandakot para matanggal ang mga basurang dala ng high tide sa kanyang bahay sa barangay Dampalit, Malabon. Problema rin niya ang lagpas tuhod na baha.
Nag-aakyat na lang kami ng gamit.
So that one is actually because of high tide, but just to show you, it's a good visuals to show as well, and even if the typhoon is gone, you know, some communities can be affected. Oops, okay. So I'll go straight to, this is the last part of my presentation. I covered the aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan, as I said, 2 weeks after it hit in 2013. And I was actually a really young reporter then. I've been on the job for like 3 months. And when my editor told me that I should go to Eastern Samar and then Tacloban to report on it, the things that I did first was read up on the reports from the ground, and I plotted it on the map. I chose the towns to visit, and of course the logistics of it all. You need to have cash because there would be no credit card machines. There would be probably no cash or banks open in the area. You should be bringing food because there's also food shortage there. You have to understand that when you land the hit, whole provinces were affected, and they were basically in crisis mode for months. Some of them did not have electricity for several months. So we had to bring a lot of food. We had to bring satellite phone, car charger, because there's no electricity, so we were charging our gadgets in the car. And of course, the cameras. One important thing that helped was, because I was still working with Inquirer then, not with ABS-CBN, but because we had correspondents on the ground as well, it helped that there were already reporters from our news agency there. So I contacted them, asked them for advice, and when we got there, they helped us find a place to stay. So it's always important to keep in touch with reporters on the ground, and not just the people from your own news organization, but from other news organizations as well. So we decided to take the road less traveled. We didn't fly into Tacloban like most reporters did. We actually drove from Manila to Bicol and then Samar. So we wanted to cover the areas that were not covered that much by media. So in this case, Eastern Samar, the eastern coast of the island. So some of the stories, just to give you ideas on the themes that you could explore when covering an aftermath of the typhoon, is the new normal. For example, in Bicol, there was a lot of congestion in the port because a lot of people were trying to cross into Samar to give help, aid. And there was also a shortage in gas because there was no electricity. A lot of people were using gas to have light at their homes to cook. So of course, there's the tragedy angle. It's a lot of people experience trauma during and after the typhoon. So it can be very difficult to interview people as well about such a sensitive topic. But these are stories that need to be told so that the rest of the country, the rest of the world would understand as well why the impact was that big, why we needed international aid as well. And of course, it's important to show stories of hope. We arrived there 2 weeks after. We wanted our readers to realize that, there's hope for these people. You could help us. You could help them adjust or rehabilitate their area. So these are good examples of hopeful stories. We were driving around Eastern Samar and we saw a vehicle with relief goods on top. So we actually waited for them to stop and we talked to the driver. We had a really good story about how he heard about what happened to his friends in in Samar, and he collected food and other goods for the survivors of the typhoon, and they drove all the way from Manila to Eastern Samar to help them. And then there's this other NGO that actually paid the residents money so they could actually earn from cleaning their own city. So those are nice stories that remind us, that it's not just tragedy, but we also have to look forward to hopeful things. And of course, government neglect. So when we went there was a lot of bodies. There were actually, if you go to Tacloban, the smell of the rotting bodies was really strong. That's something that you will not forget if you've covered the aftermath of Yolanda. And that there was a lot of talk about how the government, the local government, and the national government was handling, the retrieval and the disposal of the bodies. At the same time, the distribution of the relief goods. Here's another story I did where we interviewed the residents, and a lot of them were complaining about not receiving enough relief goods. But when we actually went to the municipal hall, there were like huge stacks of rice there, not being distributed. And the mayor simply said that he didn't want the residents to gorge or to eat all the rice in one sitting, and they wouldn't have enough until the next weeks. So it's important to raise these questions. Is what the government doing enough? Are what they doing good? So disaster risk reduction is another good angle to pursue. When I was going around Eastern Samar, I noticed the difference between two towns. So there was Balangkayan and Hernani. They were both on the eastern coast. So more or less the damage was the same. They were both hit by the storm surge. But Balangkayan had like only one person injured and 0 missing, and Hernani had hundreds injured and 72 people killed. So when I was talking to the leaders, that's when I realized that, the mayor of Balangkayan had foreseen what could happen in case of a typhoon. They understand what a storm surge was. They were clear in the evacuation procedures. So they were able to save a lot of lives because they were able to implement those policies well, as opposed to Hernani, where it was really chaotic there. Actually, a lot of people died because the covered court they went to was substandard, and it actually toppled, and a lot of people were killed during the typhoon. So climate change. Santiago was right to say that you cannot attribute it directly. Storms, you could not say that this storm is stronger because of climate change. It's something that you can probably discuss much later. For example, I did a special report on Yolanda in 2015, so that was 2 years already, and there was already consensus that climate change really helped aggravate or make it a stronger storm. So in this case, I mentioned about the fact that the land and sea surface temperature was the highest in the previous 134 years. So everything was actually ripe for a really strong typhoon like Yolanda. So ways to make stories on climate and typhoons more interesting. Personally, I like human stories. I think it's important that you always start with a personal experience of an interviewee, for example, especially if you're tackling climate change. I supported to include colorful descriptions and emotions. And you also need to simplify the concepts like storm surge. So in the Philippines, when you ask the residents, they would describe it as tsunami-like. So you have to explain that it's not a tsunami in a sense, but it kind of looks like one, and the devastation is somewhat, it's dangerous, it's life-threatening. And of course, it's important to use visuals, pictures, videos, and graphics. Finally, I think it's important to always include climate mitigation and disaster risk reduction. It's always a good segue for climate discussion, and risk reporting is very newsworthy. I think your editors would be more interested in you reporting about the risk of a typhoon than saying that your story is about climate science. So let me just show you this special report I did. Can you see the website? I am assuming you can't. Can you?
No, we can't.
Okay, wait. Let me. Okay, oops. Okay, so this is the last part. Can you see it now?
Yeah, we can see it now.
Okay. So this is just an example of like a long form story. If you're doing a long form story on climate change, so this one is about how, this was in 2015, so after 2 years after Yolanda. We incorporated a lot of videos and so interviews, so this is the human story, but also graphics as well about temperature change and how it affects typhoons. And graphs, tables, interactive tables. It's because it's easier to visualize, especially if you're talking about a lot of numbers. So it's important to show that as well. And visuals always is a good thing. It breaks down the text, so it's not very text heavy. So there. Okay. Let me just switch to my last slide. I think I cannot figure out how to switch to the last slide, but this is just ways to make stories on climate and typhoons more interesting. Oh, the last slide is other things to remember. So if you're going on a long trip, if you're gonna be like a parachute journalist, like what I did for Eastern Samar and Tacloban, you need to be with a team that you actually get along with. Because if you don't get along with your videographer, for example, you won't be able to work well. Have extra funds, as I said, extra food, extra batteries, extra everything, because you don't know what will happen. You don't know if you will be able to return immediately or if your editor will decide to actually extend you. So you have to be ready for anything. Do not expect that you will have a place to sleep in and cook. So I think I slept in the vehicle for 2 weeks. We slept in evacuation centers as well. We didn't cook, we just ate, canned goods. And helping fellow journalists. I think in the Philippines, it's very nice to see the solidarity of journalists when it comes to crisis reporting in times of tragedy. And be compassionate to survivors. In the Philippines, I know that some cultures or some journalists try to separate themselves from the people that they interview, but in the Philippines, we acknowledge, being able to help actually. So for us, compassion is very important. So it's okay if you would extend help. Don't let that person die of hunger if you have extra food that you can actually give. That's something that we actually do. That's all. Sorry if I think I took quite some time to present that.
Thank you a lot, Christine, for your presentation. That was really interesting, and it seems you have, as you know, a job that really keeps you on your feet, and it seems very adventurous as well. So thank you for your presentation, and I'm going to jump straight in. Our next presenter, yeah, it was really, really, really good and amazing, Christine. And I'm jumping straight into the other presenter, who is Julio Batista from Cuba. And Julio is a freelance journalist. He is the former editorial director of Periodísimo de Barrio and winner of the American Journalism Award, King of Spain. So it seems you come with some really good recommendation, Julio, so you can take it away.
Okay, give me a chance. Okay. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Chris, for helping me with my presentation. Well, basically, I'm a Cuban journalist, and in Cuba we have a lot of experience about hurricanes and tropical storms. Basically, hurricane tropical storms are the main weather phenomena affecting Cuba that we can say that is our curse, but and also the hurricane are the most important way to refuel our freshwater reserves. So let's see some kind of history, please. Next slide. Okay, basically in the last 20 years, Cuba was hit by 31 storms. 13 of them were severe hurricanes. Approximately the cost for the Cuban government was $27 billion in damage. And the most interesting is that in 20 years, only 45 people died as a result of these storms. I know it's a very low number of deaths considering the economic devastation, and it's especially low if you compare it with the countries in our regions. The reason for such low mortality is the education of the population of Cuba and the policies of the Cuban government. That's why the Civil Defense in Cuba is the state agency in charge of responding for weather events such as cyclones and hurricanes. Since 1962, the work of civil defense in Cuba was focused in preventing, as far as possible, the effect of storms, but its main focus is pretty focused in the protection of human lives. That's why we have so low number of deaths, people. But even the civil defense is also involved in mass evacuation, protection of population assets, and subsequent recovery. Please, the next slide. Of course, years of preparation, of training exercise, we call it meteoro. Every year, the Cuban government realized and this kind of exercise, we call it meteoro. And during those exercises, the people training for how to respond to the hurricanes and strong storms. The result is that we have a really prepared population, and they has a great challenge for us because we need to find histories about hurricanes for people who know a lot about hurricane and storms. That's pretty heavy for us, the journalists. Please, the next slide. So, added to this complex condition for doing journalism in Cuba, you need to know that it's basically legal to do journalism without belonging to the Cuban media controlled by the political power, or if you are not part of the foreign media authorized by work in the island. For that reason, our job in Periodismo de Barrio was very limited during the storms or during the covering of hurricanes. Basically because we have no credentials, because the credential was extended by the Cuban government. So, in those pretty difficult context, how we can do our job. Usually, after the hurricane, the devastated areas are highly controlled by the Cuban military force involved in the recovery work, but they hire the work of reporters who do not belong to the national press systems. Thus, without credentials, we need to move in different ways. Of course, now those extra restrictions made the reporting process extremely complex. Of course, there are tips that basics, as say Christine, extra charge, working, teamwork. Of course, preliminary just work. It's pretty important for everyone. Be careful, be extremely careful. They have a lot of importance for every journalist. But in our experience, without credentials and playing sometimes with authority, we need to be extremely careful. Keep continuously moving. Keep moving. Keep moving continuously. Work with the population. Sometimes in the small towns where everyone knows who are the neighbors, you need to blend without your surroundings. But sometimes, for example, next slide, it was funny because sometimes when you are in small towns, you are the outsider, and that's bad because everyone knows. But in big cities like Havana in the 2018 during the Hurricane Irma, it was funny because I was the outsider. It was good because the police confused me with foreign people. So the same people of Havana said, "Hey, don't worry, he's not a journalist, he's just a tourist." It was funny and it was totally useful for me. But in any case, we always remember that we are not the news. Our job is to tell the people what's happening, not to become the news. Sometimes a lot of journalists forgot this one, and for me it's pretty important. As I say, Christine, people are more than histories for the medias. They deserve all our respect in their suffering after the hurricane because sometimes they lost everything, and it's pretty hard. We are doing our job, but it's not about us or about only history. There are people and they deserve respect. Please, the next slide. So, for the last 5 years, I worked from Periodismo de Barrio. We are in small media, focusing climate change and phenomena like hurricanes. And we only have 5 people in our newsroom. So we are pretty small media with limited resource, with limited people for work. So we can do when we face that kind of disaster. Usually small medias like us, we cannot compete with the development, with the resource of news network, biggest news organization. Usually we have less logistical resource, we have less staff, and we have less responsiveness to the immediacy. So in that competition, we are totally wrong. So we need to understand that the effect of hurricane lasts long after the wind has stopped. Basically, after the hurricane, you can find a lot of history if you follow in the development of these communities, of these people. That's why sometimes that's why sometimes I like to call it the journalistic autopsy, because many times we come to these communities when for many people the subject of the hurricane is already dead. So it's our job to remember that even more that the recovery, if achieved, can take years for those communities. For example, I made an investigation 2 years ago about one community who was relocated 15 years ago, and they still live in kind of facilities. It's not homes here yet. So that's what I tell you. It's for us, for the small media, it's very important to understand our limitations facing the the hurricane, the covering of hurricanes. If you don't have, which usually you have not, too many resources, you need to focus your all force and all your people and all your resource in long-form histories to tell the people or who remember the people that hurricane live, but the effects still remaining in those communities. That's why following the stories can generate excellent research and excellent piece of investigative journalism. The next slide, please. So some issues that you can tell about after the hurricane pass is of course the recovery of those communities, the adaptation plans for affected communities, and of course the roles of authorities in the recovery of populations. Basically, in my opinion, those are probably the biggest issues after the hurricanes, because as Christine said, sometimes the government don't take the best chance for protecting the people, for protecting the economy. And the next slide. That's what I say, and that's my point of view. The small media, for the small media, this formula can be much useful than trying to compete with the immediacy of resource of large news organizations. We have not too much research. In general, small media, without the pressure of immediacy, we have sometimes the large news organizations do not have. We have time, and time means better and deeper investigation sometimes. And that's it. Thanks. Sorry, my presentation is the shortest, I think, but my friends did a lot of better than me and longer.
Thank you so much, Julio. And I guess now we'll go straight into taking some questions. And we had some questions coming in from our viewers. First, I guess, for Santiago. And the question asks, for those in Kenya, they're really directly impacted by cyclones, but the potential impacts of cyclones sometimes leads to confusion. So his question is, this question comes from Robert, I believe. How does one report well on such a phenomenon in a country that does not have direct impacts of cyclones and hurricanes?
Yeah, we're in the same, we're more or less in the same boat, Robert. I also come from a country that doesn't have direct impact from cyclones, except some freak events in the Canary Islands in particular, where we've had some remains of cyclones reaching there. But we are basically in a very safe spot in the Atlantic. So yeah, we're more or less in the same way. And from my point of view, the best way to report on cyclones is get first of all help from local reporters. Second of all, understanding very well that during cyclones there will be misinformation in breaking news. There will be problems of communication because there's blackouts, there's lacks of internet connection. Some people are not available for comment, and it's very important that you understand what a cyclone is and what is credible or not, and also that you are in touch with local journalists that can keep you informed. I say this as an editor who covers hurricanes, cyclones, typhoons, and tropical storms from all over the world, and this is a golden rule. Yeah, to really understand what's going on and understand what the reliable sources are. Understand what Tina was saying in the beginning. If what meteorological agency is in charge of monitoring this particular storm. In the guidebook that we will be uploading, you have links to all the relevant all the relevant agencies. So basically, there's a few of them in the US, one in the Philippines, one in Japan, China, Taiwan. There's another one in India, another one in Indonesia. There's another one in the Reunion Island, which is controlled by France, and another one in Papua New Guinea, Fiji, Australia, New Zealand, and a few more. So basically, depending on where the storm is and where it's moving, there will be one agency or the other taking care of it. So you need to know which one you have to follow, understand what the numbers mean, and then be in touch with local reporters that can help you understand what's going on. And then finally, when your audience is people that is conformed by people that don't necessarily are affected directly, you need to make stories that are about humans, stories that will make them understand what's going on, that this is not like the storms they used to in their hometown. This is a very different animal and a very different beast. And understanding this, bringing human stories and making them understand that these are this is an ongoing danger that doesn't, as Julio was saying, doesn't end when the wind stops. So I think those are good. Those are stories that have worked for us, and people have read and shared in Spain. That, as I said, is a very safe area cyclone-wise. I don't know if I answered your question. I think so. If not, just follow up. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that was great. Another question that came in as well is, and I guess any of you all can answer this question really. What is your #1 tip for actually, because we spoke about humanizing the story, right? And that's really important as journalists, but what is your #1 tip for creating a human story?
Is that for me as well?
Answer as well.
I cannot hear you very well. So as nobody else is unmuting themselves, I'm just taking it. Yeah, basically, I mean, as this is something I explained to some of the people who are here because they are also part of another course, and this is something that is very important. It doesn't matter really what you're talking about. Any phenomenon can be interesting if you tell it from the point of view of people. How is it affecting people? How does people live it? And for me, that's very important. It's how I insisted during my presentation about the culture that this creates. Cultures are inherently interesting, and they create amazing human stories. People react to cyclones not only by getting into a shelter, but by making stories out of it, making tales out of it, making songs, and eventually making folklore all over. And this is absolutely a great story to work with. And then as well, of course, as Tina was saying, stories about hope. These are very engaging stories, especially if you come from showing news of like devastation. So just if you are on the ground, talk to people. Just listen to people and tell their stories. It's okay. And if you are an editor and you are not on the ground, make sure that your reporters know that these are the stories that are going to work for you. Ask them, if they bring you a very technical stories, ask them to find what this means for people on the ground. If they tell you about the hectares of crops that have been devastated, ask them to talk to the farmers on the ground. So what does it mean for them? Will they get help from the government? How will this help be distributed? These are human stories that are extremely relevant and that can work anywhere in the world, regardless of if you've been affected or not as a country, as a society.
Thanks a lot, Santiago. And I just shared a link there in the chat as well that Santiago mentioned, the importance of using human stories and telling it in a way that people can understand. And I just shared a link of it. It reminded me of a song that was created locally in the Caribbean for the 1.5 campaign. And through music and through art, well, in this case, music, it's really an effective way to share the message, especially so as Santiago mentioned, knowing what the culture is in the country will help you to be able to communicate what you're trying to say in the best way possible. And for the Caribbean, that is very much music and dance. So that song actually was actually playing on the radio, across here. So, and it really got the message out there in terms of the 1.5 campaign and what that means for the Caribbean. So it's something that we need to take into consideration. And I think that's. Do we have any more questions? I believe that's it. Sure. Okay. So it doesn't seem that we have any more questions. So at this point, I'd really just like to go through each of our presentations. Okay. We have a question from Kareem.
Okay. I'm seeing Karim's question. I'll just go right. I don't know if you can hear me. I cannot hear anything, but I think you can. If you can't, just let me know. Okay. Well, basically, as you know, Karim, each story is different and each audience is different. So I cannot give you a blanket answer that actually will give you a key to write any story with climate action. And especially in a place that, as you say, some believe that climate change is not real. So basically, I think the best way to go about this is talk to people about things they know, talk to people about things they will resonate with. You don't need to give them all the information right away and ask them to accept it or leave. Give them some pieces of information, some pieces of information about climate action. Explain how people are reacting, how people are living through these tragedies, but don't ask them to just trust you blindly. Give them reasons and give them often, and I think that is more reliable than actually giving them a full science report and ask them to read it, because unfortunately they won't read it, and you will be left with nobody reading your story. So then it's not important how good it was. Make it good, make people read it, and be honest and use the science that you need. If unfortunately, it's also true that it is not. We are not robots, and there will always be people who will choose to keep on not trusting human knowledge and trust something else. So yeah, I think don't hit yourself too hard if people still don't believe it. I mean, we do what we can.
Can I answer that as well?
Sure.
Please.
So I think the marrying human interest stories and discussing climate science is actually the best way to address climate deniers, for example. In the Philippines, there are not a lot of climate deniers because I think out of the other countries, we really feel how the climate is changing and how it is affecting us in terms of the typhoons and the seasons as well. But if they don't believe the scientists, for example, maybe they will believe the ordinary people. For example, I did a story once where I interviewed the farmers, and they might not, understand exactly what climate change is. But if you ask them how it has been in the last 10 years, for example, they would tell me that the crops, the changing seasons it's making them harder to harvest good crops. Sometimes it would rain so hard, sometimes it would dry up, and they could tell you how much they're earning now compared to before because of this. And you can use that as a startup point for a more macro or a deeper discussion on climate change. And I think that's what people just need to see. They need to see concretely how this climate change affect the ordinary people. And if in your country, like, typhoons are not a big thing, or you don't get a lot of typhoons like in the Philippines, maybe you can find another natural phenomenon that seem to be affecting you. Dizan mentioned at the start about how some areas are now feeling that they're being more affected by typhoons. That was actually one of our questions then when we were starting our report on Haiyan, because there were areas in the Philippines that did not get a lot of strong typhoons, and they were starting to get stronger typhoons. So I think there are more studies on that now, but it would be, I think it is important to ask the ordinary people what they are observing on the ground and maybe link that up to what the scientists are finding out.
Yes, thank you, Christine. And I guess I have a question as well that I think can benefit, the everyone here. And it's, have you ever made any perhaps blunt hurricane reporting that you can probably share with us so that we can maybe avoid similar mistakes? Hello?
I think we couldn't hear you very well. You got frozen for a second, Yuzan. Maybe
yeah,
if you can type.
I think we missed part of your question.
Yeah, if you can type your question, I think that would be easier.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Right. So my question was for Julio, and I guess it's just, can you share with us any mistakes that you may have made in your hurricane reporting? Because that's the only way that one of the most important that we can learn, right, is acknowledging our mistakes. And can you share with us perhaps a mistake that you made in the past that, and what you learned from it so that we can all benefit and mistakes in our own reporting?
Sorry, Isan, can you repeat the last part of your question? I can hear nothing.
All right, I'm going to type my question.
Better option. Oh. Oh, well. Believe me, when you started, you committed a lot of mistakes. For example, you don't use the property clothes for covering the hurricanes, and sometimes you forget that you go for the field, not for the camping. For example, you can use shorts. They are more comfortable sometimes for walk, but you can't protect your legs. So please never use shorts unless you can swim. Sometimes, for example, my first time I forget my extra batteries for my cell phone. It was a disaster. I was without cell phone after 3 hours of interviews. So yes, please, extra batteries always. And for example, the Cuban conditions are pretty different in a lot of countries. But my first time I posted in my wall in Facebook, well, we are working in that covering, some kind of covering, and 3 hours later we have the Cuban police behind us. So if you are working in Cuba, please don't post it, anything in your wall of Facebook.
All right, thank you, Julio. Some great advice there. And my last question will be for Christine. And I'm just looking at in terms of the Philippines and climate migration. Have you ever reported on the link between climate migration and hurricanes in the Philippines? Please tell me you heard me. Hello?
Yeah. No, I'm sorry. I haven't done any story on that, unfortunately.
Okay. All right. I think it's something that's really opening up here, specifically for the Caribbean, with regards to the last I think it was in 2017, after we were hit by two Category 5 hurricanes, one after the next. Like one, it was Hurricane Irma, and then 2 weeks later, Hurricane Maria, that really flattened a lot of islands in the Leeward Islands and Puerto Rico. And I think Hurricane Irma, that toll was somewhere over 3,000 people. And since then, you know, it's been a serious situation that we've been looking at in terms of climate migration. Where do people go? Where do people move? What are the options for them after, you know, being so devastated? So it's something I'm really interested in learning some more about. And do we have any more questions? I don't think so. So that brings us, I guess, to the end of this webinar session. But of course, we'll be making this video, which was recorded live, open and live, and available on our website at climatetracker.org.